And welcome to the 2022 Parks King Lecture. This is the very first lecture that we've been able to have in person this semester. And what an occasion. In 2000-2001, the Divinity School created this series to honor two great Americans, Rosa Parks, who on the 1st of December in 1955 refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, and the minister who was volunteered by members of his church to help lead a movement that began as a reaction to that incident. A young man at the time, but a name that we all know, Martin Luther King. I never had the privilege of meeting either Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. I have had the good fortune of meeting some of the people who were close to them. The attorney who had lunch with Rosa Parks on that fateful December 1st day and was her attorney, and then was Martin Luther King's attorney as long as he was in Montgomery, was somebody who, Fred Gray, whom I've had the privilege to get to know and think a great deal of. I've met some of the other people from that circle, people like Jesse Jackson and John Lewis. What struck me about all the people whom I've met is they were all ministers. They were all people who used their faith as a way of trying to change society. We're now in a new generation, but as we mark them, we are marking them with people who are now the leaders. So several years ago, the now senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, who is also a senator, U.S. Senator from the state of Georgia, Raphael Warnock, delivered these lectures. And tonight, we have the leading religious figure who is a champion for the rights of the poor and for those who are oppressed in this country to address us. And we're very privileged to have one of his former professors to introduce him tonight. It's not often that your students become this famous. And the professor's not quite as famous, but pretty close. So, Professor Willie Jennings, would you come introduce your student?
Thank you, Dean Sterling. It is a joy for me to be here with you all this evening and to introduce our lecturer for tonight. The Reverend Dr. William Barber II, as our dean said, is quite simply one of the most important religious leaders of our generation and one of the most important moral voices of the 21st century. Raised in the heart of the church, bathed in its sound of preaching and praise and protest and its genius, he embodies all of it. He is a proud graduate of North Carolina Central University, Duke University Divinity School, and Drew University. It would take up the entire time if I try to list all of this man's numerous awards, including the MacArthur Genius Award. But it is important for you to know that the Reverend Dr. William Barber II is the president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, bishop in the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, and long-time pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina, where he has served with absolute excellence. Barber is also famously known as the architect of the Moral Monday movement, which began with weekly Moral Monday protests, where ministers and religious leaders and everyday people got the courage to protest, be arrested, and do it again. And that Moral Monday movement was relaunched in 2020 under the banner of the Poor People's Campaign. He is the author of 4 fabulous books. He is a regular commentator on a number of television programs and news outlets. But most importantly, Reverend William Barber II is a servant of the living God, whose life he already gives witness to, and whose life already echoes the words of our Savior. Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done. My friends, please join me in welcoming this year's Park King Lecturer, the Reverend William Barber II.
Well, it's good to be here. Might we pray. Gracious, eternal God, we know that whenever you call men and women to preach, you take the risk of putting treasure in an earthen vessel, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, sometimes faithful, sometimes failing. But you do it that the excellency of the power might be of thee and not of us. Once again, perform the miracle of grace and hide us behind the cross. Cover us in your blood. Fill us with your spirit, that the words of our mouth and the meditation of our heart might be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and blessed Redeemer. Come, Holy Spirit, come with each hearing, teaching, and doing power. Amen. I am honored to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, for a gracious introduction, and Dean Sterling for your kind remarks. It is good to get to know you all and know Willie again. And I would say, like they say in the church, can we celebrate the angel of this house, the dean? Amen. To all of the other professors, scholars, janitors, anybody that does anything to make this place run, most of all the students who are here from across the width and the breadth of the world. I was listening to Dean Sterling and Dr. Jennings, and I said, I know what they're doing. You know, there was a guy in Kentucky, and he put his mule in the Kentucky Derby. It was a swayback mule, couldn't hardly make it. Cost $10,000. And somebody came to him and said, sir, have you lost your mind? You know goodness well that that mule is not going to compete with those thoroughbreds. He said, I know that. He said, by the time he comes out of the gate, they'll have finished the race. Why would you put that swayback mule in a race with those thoroughbreds? He said, well, I thought the exposure might do him some good. And so I'm glad that Dean Sterling and Jennings think the exposure at Yale might do me some good, and I hope it does. To the team that's with me, Reverend Dr. Della Owens and attorney Roz Pellis, where they, and Jonathan Hotgrove and attorney, what's your name? I'm just teasing, Valerie Ekrama. Don't ever try to preach and can't laugh, because this world will make you cry, so you ought to laugh sometimes. Amen. And Dean, I would issue just a slight correction. You know, prior to Dr. King being at Dexter Avenue, Vernon Johns was there. and they kicked Vernon Johns out because of the radical nature. You know, Dexter Avenue was a silk stocking church, as they called it down in the South. And they brought King there because they thought he would be less radical, and he was young. They actually fought him joining the movement. They did not welcome him being in the movement. And after the long trek of 381 days, he was only able to stay there a couple of more years because literally the deacons pushed him out, which is how he ended up back in Atlanta. Just thought I'd tell some of you aspiring prophetic preachers that in case you're planning on pastoring a church. I want to talk tonight about why this moment demands a poor people's low-wage workers assembly, thank you so kindly, and moral march on Washington and to the polls to declare new possibilities in America and inspire new possibilities around the world. Why this moment demands a generationally transformative mass moral gathering that's not a day or an event, but a declaration and a statement to the nation that somebody's been hurting our brothers and sisters, and we won't be silent anymore. If we are truly to honor the witness of saints, yes, saints like the Bible speaks of them with the small s, like Rosa Parks and Martin King, we must make some effort to learn from the ways they responded to the moments in their history at the time of their living. To use a word that should be familiar in a divinity school, we must endeavor to understand and imitate their practice of discernment. Their practice of discernment. We cannot understand Ms. Parks' protest in the Montgomery movement that ensued without remembering that she said, as she understood it, after 12 years of working with the local NAACP, the moment of Emmett Till's murder necessitated a moral movement. It was almost as if Rosa Parks understood, by the way, she formerly had been investigating rapes of black women in the Deep South. She was very much engaged. And if you think she just some one day after working just decided to sit down kind of out of the blue, I've got a couple of bridges I'd like to sell you in some foreign countries. This was a process of discernment. And it's almost as though when she looked at the death, the violent, vicious 75-pound cotton gin murder of Emmett Till, that she recognized that it was a moment that said to her, if in fact they take one of our boys and violently murders him, and his mother has the courage to have an open casket funeral and make everybody look at that face to see what racism will actually do in an attempt to maintain its supremacy. Rosa Parks knew when those killers were acquitted and were not prosecuted, that this was not an isolated act of violence. That August 28th, which by the way would later become the day of the March on Washington, and the day President Obama would accept the nomination of a party to be president of this country, but that day, August 28th, was first the day Emmett Till was murdered. And she knew that there had been a lot of Emmett Tills. There are a lot of stories in the South of families when they look back on their family tree and you say, well, what happened to so-and-so? And people say, we don't know. All we know is they left home one day and it's almost as though they disappeared from the world. She knew that it wasn't an isolated. She knew that it was an expression of white rage and, more importantly, an expression of defiance against the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The Brown decision had just happened a year earlier. And by the way, the first riots about the Brown decision didn't happen in the South, it happened in New York, in the North. But the South's reaction was, before we will desegregate, we will murder your children, as did Herod in the Bible. And Rosa Parks understood that. She understood it in the context that the Koch brothers' daddy was calling for the impeachment of Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, whom almost everybody had bet would never vote for desegregation and to overturn the Plessy decision. She knew his death was about pitting the poor white Southerner against their black neighbors. She knew that his murder was an attempt to defend the system that kept power consolidated in the hands of the Southern aristocracy, and that violence was one of the ways that had been used in slavery and even the deconstruction of Reconstruction in the 19th century. And Parks knew that the death of one Emmett Till required the takedown of the whole system. You take one of our sons, we don't hand you back violence. We don't burn up our own communities. We don't destroy ourselves. We mobilize and take down the entire system that produced the possibility of that death in the first place. You see, Parks had been to Highlander up in the Tennessee mountains. She was sent there by two white women, her dear friends in Montgomery. It wasn't just a black movement. The Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham, Selma, those weren't just black movements. Down in Montgomery, there was a strong contingency of white Southerners that were breaking away from the racism of that era. They had Senator Highlander. This lady right to my left used to lead Highlander, Ms. Roz Pellis. Highlander was a place where people of all different races went together in the hills of Appalachia and Tennessee to strategize on how to be a movement, multi-ethnic movements toward a multi-ethnic democracy. She had built relationships with people who could organize. She had taken her lunch breaks in the law office around the corner to consider her actions before they ever happened. And in the midst of all of that, she discerned that it was time to refuse to comply with Jim Crow, and she was not the first. But she carried a certain moral authority because of who she was in the community, who she was in the church, who she was in the society. And she knew it was time to organize a citywide boycott of segregated buses. It was time to wage a nonviolent campaign against the injustices that had shaped her whole life. And the death of Emmett Till, the destruction of Emmett Till, demanded the resurrection of a nonviolent movement. So if you think it just happened because a middle-aged lady just decided to sit down, I would ask you to go back and do some social exegesis and make sure you have the historical context. If you think that the black folk in that community turned out 20,000 flyers on the old Memorex machine, some of y'all are not even old enough to remember that you had to put a stencil on. Talk to me, tell me your age. Y'all remember that? Huh? And you had to put ink on it, and then you roll it, and then the stencil around. If you think they did that in one night, It was even strategic when she sat down. She sat down close enough to the weekend that it wouldn't give time for the preachers to cool off. She sat down close enough that they would be forced, in some sense, to act. And her discernment and her actions became a watershed moment. Her discernment propelled Dr. King into the movement. He didn't go to Montgomery to be in the movement. He went to Montgomery to preach at Dexter Avenue about 5 years and then to go back to Morehouse and be dean of the School of Religion. But in that moment, he got baptized, if you will, into the movement that would lead to his crucifixion and would now lead to us today having a resurrection of his ideas. And in that time, he learned the importance of discerning the moment as well. He had been trained and formed even in his college undertaking, even before he knew all about Gandhi, in what was called the militant revolutionary love of Jesus, in a program that was partially put together by professors from Yale and professors from Howard, the Niebuhr boys and Howard Thurman. Dr. King continued to move, and as he grew, in fact, he didn't just start talking about economics in '67. In one sermon in Montgomery, he preached Paul's letter to the American Christians, and in that letter, that sermon, he talked about the 1% ruling over the 99%. But by the time he gets to '67, after the March on Washington, after Selma, he's talking about two Americas. And he talked about how any nation captive to militarism is on a downward spiritual spiral, and that this nation had to face three triune evils, and they could never be separated: racism, militarism, and poverty. In '67, after having done a speech at Riverside on the Vietnam War, but also connecting these three triune evils, he met with women from the Welfare Rights Union, and they were the ones that actually pushed him to do the Poor People's Campaign. It was the welfare rights women, those sisters who were poor and impacted. And they pushed him more to be involved in the peace movement because he was reluctant. The first speech given to the peace movement was by Coretta and not Martin. She went on his behalf. And they said, we have to deal with this. And his discernment in that moment was that the moment demanded a mass poor people's campaign, not just a sermon, not just a letter, but a campaign, not an event, not a rally. Have you ever noticed they never called their actions back then events and rallies? It was always campaigns because they understood evil would never relent just because you do something one time. They were real clear. If you were committed only to do something one time, evil will actually sit there and watch you do it with a sandwich and a drink, and then know that's it. That's all you're going to do is holler one time. He knew there had to be a campaign, and the campaign had to be led by poor people, not for poor people, but led by them from all different backgrounds, every race, creed, color. One of his first meetings had Latino people and indigenous people and Jewish and Christian and others coming together. He knew that there could not be a real black agenda that was not an agenda that addressed racism and militarism and poverty, and there would be no success with a black agenda unless you built a moral fusion coalition of people to address racism, militarism, and poverty simultaneously. He knew that we had two Americas. One, as he said, flowed with milk and honey, and the other that flowed with poverty and despair. And he said, we're going to D.C. and we're going to stay there until the systems change. Actually, if I have time, what he planned to do in '68 was the original plan for 63, but it was undermined by black folk. You see, in 1963, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin had planned for an action in 63. They originally wanted it to happen in May when the Congress was still in session. It would include civil disobedience the whole week, and then a march on Washington, and SNCC and SCLC and Dr. King agreed to it, but some of the other civil rights organizations said, well, we don't want to be that aggressive. And so they watered it down and watered it down. They didn't want to deal with the fact that the March on Washington was not a black march. It was a march for jobs and justice. One of the campaign demands was a $2 minimum wage, which would be $15 today. And there's a lot of story about that. You ought to read a book called It's Time to Learn, a Time to Teach by Julian Bond, which he unpacks a lot of stuff that most of us have never heard, even down to there were some agreements by people that all the speeches would be vetted. And that's why there was such problems when John Lewis chose to criticize the current administration in his speech. And so in 68, what Dr. King is calling for is really what should have happened in 63, but calling for it with all of its Jesus revolutionary fiber and strength. And so there he was, but then he gets a call, come by Memphis, because there were black and white sanitation workers. And you know what happened, right? Two workers, it was raining and thunderstorm, and they got in the back of the garbage truck, and the lightning struck, and it shorted out the switch, and the truck closed down on them and killed them, smashed them to death. And he was invited to come to Memphis by one of the labor unions that were there, and most of his staff told him not to go. In fact, some of them said, why go there with those garbage workers? And he said, the issue is not what's going to happen to me, but what's going to happen to them if I don't go. And so he went to Memphis. The FBI disrupted the march. There was a whole group of preachers, black preachers, that had planned to put a full-page ad in the New York Times denouncing King and the efforts of nonviolence. By that time, after the speech in 1967, he had lost all of his invitation privilege to the White House. Over 150 newspapers had written against him, and every civil rights organization that now lift him up had actually written resolutions against him, including his own denomination. That's where he was. The night that he felt at home only with, let me have a towel, where he felt at home only with and among poor folk. And that night, before he was killed in Memphis, Dr. King stood in the pulpit for the last time, and he said these words, Dean Sterling, and they trouble me even to the day. Nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. And then he said, because this nation is sick, and we've got to give ourselves to this movement. And with his face set like flint on the work he had discerned that moment required, he continued to call for a Poor People's Campaign. And then his bodies was shut down when a .30-06 deer rifle severed his entire spine as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel. I come here today, and I want to follow the model of Mrs. Parks and Dr. King and try to discern what our present moment demands us. And if we discern the signs of the times, what does our moment demand, and what might it look like for us to give ourselves to this moment and the movement required? When I reread the Constitution of these United States and I look at the glaring realities of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care, the underfunding of public education, the war economy, and the false and distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism coupled with notions of white supremacy, it is clear to me that we face a crisis of civilization, a crisis of democracy, and a crisis of possibility. How is it that those things can exist when our documents that tell us who we are supposed to be say that as a people we are supposed to establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general, let me see, sure this word is in the Constitution? Welfare. And then only can we ensure domestic tranquility. But we also must ensure equal protection under the law, not for every American, but for all persons, all people. And that nobody has the right to deny or abridge the right to vote. And yet with all of that, as King once said, high blood pressure of creeds, we still face such an anemia of deeds. When I read Amos chapter 5 in light of this moment, because I was taught when I was in Divinity school, you don't study the text first, you study the context of the text. Then you go to the text. And so looking at this context and then thinking about how every day our political systems, Congress and Senate and state, they open with prayer. They all swear themselves in, most of them, on the Bible. And I so often wonder, have you read it? Do you know what's in it? How can you pray to open Congress and then pray, P-R-E-Y, on the very people God gives the most attention to in the Bible when God talks about what our ministry is supposed to be? And so when I read a text like Amos 5, it strikes me that this moment calls for what Amos 5 talks about. Can I read it in the Message Bible? Is that okay at Yale to read the Message Bible? My Hebrew is a little weak today, and I don't want to do King James. But in the Message Bible, it talks about poverty and injustice being so real and that people are almost wanting to give up. It talks about how it's an epidemic. It talks about how people are taking bribes on the left and the right. That's actually in that text in Amos 5 in the Message Bible. On the left and the right to keep in place the systems of injustice. And then God says to Amos in that moment, and I had not looked at this as clearly, because normally when we go to Amos 5, we go to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Put away your noise, da, 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 da. Then we go to Amos chapter 6, woe to those who are at ease in Zion. But I didn't read the pericope right, as most of us hadn't. So I had to go back up and come down. And what's before all of that is God says to Amos, in that moment of so much pain and injustice and mistreatment of the poor, go out into the streets and lament loudly. I mean, I need somebody to cry. I need them to cry. I need them to fill up the malls and the shops with the cries of doom. I need them to weep loudly. Not me, not us, not on our watch. I need somebody that will empty the offices, the stores, the factories, the workplace. I need all of those that are willing to do this to engage in a general lament. I need a remnant who will act as though something is wrong. I need a remnant, if you will. I hear Amos saying like Zora Neale Hurston. When Zora Neale Hurston said, if you smile when other people are causing you pain, they will then kill you and say you enjoyed it. God says to Amos, I want to hear you loud crying, acting as though something is wrong and you know it. And only when the remnant cries and acts like something is wrong will I make my visit. I'm not going to make my visit if you just pray in a comfortable place. I'm not going to make my visit if you just preach. I'm only going to make my visit if you go in the streets and lament loudly. And I don't need everybody, but I need a remnant. It's almost like what he said to Isaiah, when Isaiah got caught up that day in the temple and all the excitement got to him, the seraphims and the lights and the shaking. And he said, oh, here, my Lord, send me. Because sometimes, all the excitement, you say all kinds of things. Lord, I'll never turn around. And then the Lord said, okay, I'll send you. And then Isaiah thought for a minute, wait a minute, how long? And God said, until you. And he said, okay, God, well, how many people are going to listen to me? God said, maybe 10%. He said, 10%? Anointed by you, that's all 10%? Following what you told me to do, 10%? Yes, 10%. But that remnant. And Amos, God tells Amos the same thing, I need a remnant. I need a remnant of impacted people and their allies in the street, the remnant, the rejected. They must lead the revival until lives are changed, until systemic racism is dealt with, and classism, and homophobia, and Islamophobia. The remnant must be there. The remnant, those impacted by the ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, the remnant. And if I had time, and I don't, I could tell you how the New Testament picks it up again on the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost was not just a time of exciting people, even for old Pentecostal like me. On my mother's side, it was more than just about speaking tongues. It was about speaking new tongues that were different than the tongues of Caesar, that the everyday people would understand, and the impacted people would understand. So why do I say this moment demands a gathering, a remnant? Because we face this crisis of civilization. We can see our present crisis in the conversations and the debates we're having that are so shallow for this moment. In the moment of COVID, after 20+ million people lost their jobs, millions of people infected, over 750,000 deaths, nearly 1 million, and 8 million more people falling into poverty, where in this moment, billionaires have over the last 20-some months made over $2 trillion, while people are suffering, who were already suffering before COVID, because before COVID, 700 people were dying a day from poverty, 250,000 a year. And what is the conversation we hear even on the TV at night? It's about top lines and legislative packages, and whether or not if we help poor people, it's going to make them lazy. And why we can't afford 1.9 trillion over 10 years or 3.5 trillion over 10 years when we just gave corporations 4 trillion over 20 months. We need a meeting. A mass poor people's assembly, poor people's low-wage workers assembly, moral march on Washington in a time when we have more wealth than ever in the history of the world. And some want to limit the debate to the cost. How much does it cost? What about the larger question that Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, raises? He's one of our advisors in the Poor People's Campaign. This question, the question is not how much does it cost to do it, how much does it cost not to do it? Far too many, even now, want to ask the possibility strangling question. Why should we do this? Shouldn't we just trust the markets? Isn't poverty really people's personal choice and not a policy decision? Here we are in this moment. We are too often caught up in commentary about the probability of policy passing that will actually weaken people's morality. I can't believe the other day there was an economist on, and I was talking to Jeffrey Sachs, and and he wrote an article challenging him. The economist literally was blaming inflation on the money that was given to help people during COVID. Just a straight out lie. The good, bright economists tell him. I was talking to the economist and said, no, the inflation is the result that we're facing something we haven't seen since the Great Depression in terms of the stress on the economic systems. And part of the inflation is because the corporations held back on their production but kept going on their wealth. And they created, almost pimped the system, if you will. Here we are, struggling with whether or not we can have child income tax credit. And you claim to lift 50% of children out of poverty for 3 or 4 months and then drop them right back in poverty. You know what we were really arguing about with the BBB plan? And by the way, I'm not here to promote that plan because actually the Poor People's Campaign believes it ought to be $10 trillion over 10 years, according to the Economic Policy Institute. That what we really need, even if we didn't have COVID, hear me, even if there wasn't COVID, but surely after COVID, we need an investment of $10 trillion, $1 trillion a year in things that work to address the issues of social dislocation and poverty and low wealth, because there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country, even before COVID ever hit. 43% of the nation, 52% of our children, 66 million white people, 26 million black people, 68% of Latinos, 68% of indigenous people, 73 million women before COVID ever hit that we've been ignoring. There was already a depression before COVID depression hit. COVID exposed the fissures of racism and poverty. And so the Economic Policy Institute says what we really need is $10 trillion, $1 trillion a year, or about 5% of our gross domestic product, which is $2.21 trillion, to be invested, not just spent, but invested in the uplift of the community, which will actually come back. Because if today you passed a bill that provided people a $15 living wage, which is what Dr. King in the March on Washington was asking 57 years ago, more than 50 years ago. That's what they wanted, $2, which would be $15 today. If you did that today, considering that the minimum wage hasn't been raised for 9 years, it's at $7.25, considering that the government's measure of poverty says that if you make $12,800 a year, you're not poor, considering that there's not a county in this country, including in Connecticut, where a person making $7.25 an hour can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment, considering that restaurant workers make $2.13 an hour plus tips, and most restaurant workers couldn't qualify for COVID relief, even though they were deemed essential workers that had to go to work, but they couldn't qualify because their base pay didn't meet the threshold. Considering all that, if we pass a minimum wage bill for $15 living wage, it would lift 31 million Americans out of poverty, 41% of African Americans with 1 vote. The BBB, I'm not promoting that. What I'm talking about is what it was talking about, universal pre-care. It was talking about climate investments. It was talking about earned income tax credit. It was talking about $130 billion to expand Medicaid. You mean to tell me in the midst of COVID, our conscience is so dull as a nation, we can't even make sure people have health care? When we're the only of the 25 wealthiest countries in the world that doesn't provide some form of universal health care? The United States is the only one. You want to talk about exceptionalism? The country with the greatest wealth and the greatest ability to offer health care is the only country in the whole world of the 25 wealthiest that doesn't offer some form of universal health care. And even in the midst of COVID, poor and low wealth people were the first to be forced to go to work. Because you know what we did? We did a linguistic shift. In the streets, we call it 3-card Molly. It's a linguistic shift. We said to certain people that had to cut our meat and had to make sure we had our stuff, we said to them, you are now essential workers. Before COVID, you were service workers, but now you're essential workers. But then over the last 2 years, we've treated them like they were expendable. But essential meant you have to go to work, you're the first to be put at risk, You will be the first to get sick and the first to die. Because the majority of the people that have died in this million have not been upper middle class, it's been poor and low wealth people. We have a study getting ready to come out on April the 4th about this very fact. And you know the one piece of data that the government is not keeping in one place to measure? How COVID has impacted the very people Jesus put first, the poor. You can't find, they had data on black folk, they had some data, but that piece of data, my daughter's a PhD in public health from Harvard, and she's crying about that. She said, Daddy, they're deliberately hiding that perhaps the reason we haven't had even a week of national mourning. God, how do you do that? How do you have 1 million people almost die and we haven't had a week of national mourning, and now everybody wants to get back to normal? Maybe it's because the people that are dying really don't matter to most folks. BBB was talking about affordable housing. It was a step to a different kind of conversation. And yet, we saw 2 Democrats that come from states with some of the greatest poverty. You know, West Virginia has 750,000 people living, poor and low wealth, 350,000 making less than the living wage. And I can tell you that the people in the hollers and in the hood of West Virginia, they are mad as fire. They're lied on. They're told that they vote against their own interests. No, they don't. Most of them don't even vote because they see both sides of the political aisle refusing to talk about them. Answer me this question. When is the last time you have heard a president, or have you ever heard a presidential debate on poverty? Just think about that. You got 140 million people in poverty, 43% of the nation. This is where Dr. King was when he was there. And this is where Rosa was as well. She was a part of the Poor People's Campaign. And 140 million people, poor and low wealth in this country, 52% of the children, and no presidential candidate on either side of the aisle is ever asked, how are you going to deal with that? Amos, God told Amos in a time like that, when they're taking bribes on the left and the right, there's got to be a meeting in the street, a mass moral meeting where the impacted people cry and force the nation to hear. So we've got work to do, because the debates we're having in this country aren't starting at the right place. So I was at the Vatican recently meeting with economists and philosophers and theologians of different faiths, and Pope Francis said, today we see that the world has never been so rich, and yet despite such abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow in these times of opulence. When it should be possible to put an end to poverty, the powers of one-track thinking say nothing of the poor, the elderly, the migrants, the unborn, and the seriously ill, mostly invisible. They are treated as disposable. And Pope Francis said both trickle-down economics and neoliberalisms are forms of evil magic. Evil magic that bewitch society to think there is a way to deal with poverty and low wealth and the collateral damages of racism and ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy without dealing with poverty. We gave $2.3 million in COVID relief to businesses that didn't even go through Congress. Did y'all know that? $2.3 million of your money that didn't even go through Congress. Came straight from the Treasury, went to be under some guys that they were in trouble. And we arguing about 1.9 trillion over 10 years. Amos says, God said to Amos, in times like this, I got to get a remnant that'll put a face on this. That we can no longer have conversations about numbers. We got to put a face. We've got to make society in this moment see and hear. See and hear the 39 million children that are poor and low wealth, the 21 million elders, the 65 million men, the 74 million women, the 66 million white people, the 26 million black, the 38 million Latinos, the 8 million Asians, the 2.14 million natives. There has to be a gathering, a mass moral gathering. The 87 million people who are either uninsured or underinsured, the 4 million people that get up every morning and can buy unleaded gas and cannot buy unleaded water. The people who are affected because 57 years after Episcopalians and Anglicans and Catholics and Baptists and Methodists and others marched from churches across bridges and were beaten for a Voting Rights Act, we have less voting rights today than we had 57 years ago, and it didn't start with Trump. It started on June 25th, 2013, when the Supreme Court gutted Section 5, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg sounded like a prophet from the Supreme Court. She didn't sound like a justice, she sounded like a prophet. And she said, this action is like putting up your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm, and I guarantee you, there will be a flooding of voter suppression. And it happened. Right now, we spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war, and I wanted to talk about war because we spend only 15 cents on education and health care. 53 cents, and here we are now in the middle of war, and I strongly believe that because this war we're seeing with Ukraine is really about pride and pipelines and autocrats. And in some ways, when two politicians block us from dealing with voting rights and dealing with poverty and low wealth, at least somewhat, they wound this democracy in such a way that an autocrat like Putin smells blood. Because if the folk can't unify to save their own selves and their own cousins and their own people, surely I can attack now. And even now, what's needed, Dr. Jennings said this morning, the folk have been given two choices, run or shoot. There's one other choice. 1 million or 2 million Ukrainians all joining hands and standing in front of those tanks like they did in Tiananmen Square, enforcing the whole world. Because the one thing an autocrat fears is a moral movement of the people. That's why they try to do wars quick like Machiavelli. They fear mass movement. And anytime autocrats have been put down and run out of countries, there always had to be some moral gathering non-violently where the people said, we ain't afraid of your tank. And you can't kill us all. And they stood together. And so here we are. And what I'm saying to you is not just numbers. As I close, I'm talking about the white men and women and black that I've met in the hills of Appalachia. I'm talking about, as I said this morning, the coal miners in Kentucky who have black lung, and they've watched the same politician that block voting rights then work a deal with the mining companies to take their insurance and their pensions. I'm talking about Callie Greer, who lives in Alabama, but when it comes to health care and when it comes to ecological devastation, Alabama still looks like the civil rights movement never happened. And Callie Greer lost her child because they refused to expand Medicaid. And one military budget to Lockheed Martin for 1 year could pay for every state that has denied Medicaid expansion. I'm talking about the people in North Carolina who've been rejected over and over again. I'm talking about, when I close my eyes, seeing Vanessa and her dad of the Apache Nation in Arizona, who right now are fighting to hold on to their Mount Sinai, their Mecca, the founding place of the Apache religion, that in some ways resembles Pentecostalism if you really sit down with them for a while. And accompany because they want to drill in the ground and take up dirt, and only about 1% of what they take will produce something. They're willing to destroy the entire religious history of the Apache Nation. And so right now, as we're in here, the Apache people are nonviolently living on that mountain. I'm talking about Rosanelle Eaton, who was 99, almost 98 years old when she died. When she was 95, she stood up to voting rights in North Carolina and helped lead a 6-year campaign to block voter suppression. I'm talking about Amy in West Virginia, who says, I'm a member of the working poor, and she's a teacher. I'm talking about Leon, a veteran that I met in a homeless camp in Aberdeen, and he has an American flag planted on a tree outside the car that he uses as his home. And I asked him why, and he said, Pastor, they allowed me to run billion-dollar pieces of equipment in the military, but now that I've come home, I can't even flip a burger. So I fly that flag so that hopefully people will see the flag and then come and see what's happening underneath its wrinkled furrows. This is why we have to keep mobilizing and organizing. This is why we have discerned that we must have in this moment a generationally transformative mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington. And to the polls, in this moment, we must put a face on these numbers and these realities. In this moment, we must build a stage for impacted people to lament, to cry, to force the country and the world to see their faces, along with religious leaders, along with their advocates, but to also build power and to also put before a nation, this nation, a third Reconstruction that shows it doesn't have to be. We got 400 people right now making an average of $97,000 an hour in this country, and we can't pay a living wage. Yes, we must have a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly. Dr. King was killed while he was working on this more than 50 years ago. He was demanding a Marshall Plan then. He wrote a memo in '68 to the sitting president, and he said, we cannot turn back from this. Dr. King knew that but also when Dr. King was killed, when he was killed, something else began to happen to try to make sure this kind of gathering would never take place. Pat Buchanan wrote a memo to the sitting president and said this. It's found in a book called About the Illusion. It's found in the writings of Kevin Phillips. And the memo said to the president, we must engage in positive polarization. We must have a plan to intentionally split the nation in half with racism, classism, and homophobia for the purpose of holding on to power, and we must do it and always deny it publicly. What you've seen with Trump and others is not their idea, it's an inherited audience. And so here we are. Here we are in this mist. And every year we lose. Every year we lose $1 trillion to child poverty because we don't do the kind of investments we ought to do. Every $1 that goes into low-wage workers' pockets gets multiplied into $1.20. Every year we have inaction on the climate change. It could ultimately cost us not only lives, but $3 trillion annually. We must have a mass poor people's assembly, low-wage workers assembly, and moral march on Washington. We must have a third Reconstruction. We cannot continue like this. The question before us is not will the Democratic Party survive or the Republican Party survive, but can America survive? Because this country's framework cannot continue to hold the tension of nearly 50% of its people living in poverty and low wealth. And perhaps because the insurrection we just recently saw, because it was not the only one in American history, the one that we most recently saw happened on January 6th, it is more than just something that happened. Perhaps, Dean, it really is a prophetic epiphany. January 6th was Epiphany, right? Could it be that what we saw on January 6th is a warning? And the warning is not about what they're going to do, because most of those people were upper class and engaged in white supremacy and religious nationalism. What will happen if the 140 million poor and low-wealth people lose hope? What you saw on the 6th could be the tip of the iceberg. And Dr. King knew this. And he knew that the energy is going to go somewhere. And either it's going to be led, like Amos said, in a nonviolent way where people use wailing and crying to be seen, so that that watershed moment can produce justice rolling down like waters, or it could turn in another way. We have to say to this nation, it's time to expand health care, time to pay a living wage, time to secure our voting rights, time to guarantee housing for all, time to guarantee the right to clean water. It's time, it's past time. Some of this stuff was passed in the UN resolution of 1948. It's way past time for the things I've been talking about to be seen as human right. In fact, it's time for us to see poor and low-wealth people as human beings. There must be a major mass poor people's, low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls. It must happen now. And it must be a generationally transformative moment that shifts the moral narrative, that builds power, that puts a face on the pain and connects a voice to the struggles, because we need a revolution of the heart. We need a moral revival. That's the only hope. That's the only hope to get to the policies. As one writer says, you will never get to prophetic implementation until you have a transformed prophetic imagination. And so here's where we are, watershed. Let me close here and take some questions. Dean, when I was coming here this week, I stopped by Buffalo to stand with Starbucks workers who are organizing a union where the CEO has made reference to the Holocaust in the way in which he is holding down the rights of black and white Starbucks union workers. While I was there, since we were so close to Niagara Falls, I had never seen it nor heard it, so I said, let's go see it. It's an astounding thing to see. For me, a country boy, to see all the force of it. It's a watershed. It's a watershed where all of the force narrows and it comes together in one place. And when that happens, it alters the landscape. It impacts everything downstream and upstream. Because the watershed of a river determines the power of the river. It determines how that river can move the things that try to stop that river from flowing. And as I stood there looking at that Niagara Falls watershed, it occurred to me that a watershed is long. The Mississippi watershed stretches from the nation's northern border all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. You don't get a Niagara Falls every 2 miles. Watershed moments, watersheds in rivers only come every so often. But when they come, when they are produced by nature, will they change everything? And isn't that the story of human history? The parting of the Red Sea was a watershed moment, and it changed everything. Calvary and the resurrection was a watershed moment. Pentecost was a watershed moment. The Reconstruction in the American South, when black and white people, the former slaves and poor and low-wealth white people who had figured out that they had been used by the slave masters, came together and they gave birth to the 14th and 15th Amendment, and then later on to the amendments that would give rights to women to vote. Well, watershed moment. The Montgomery bus boycott was a watershed moment Ms. Parks played her part, Dr. King played his, but the energy that is always with us got channeled into a nonviolent Niagara Falls, if you will, that set off a chain of events that changed the flow of this river we call democracy. Every so often, we need a watershed moment. And that's what the prophet Amos is talking about. God says you got a choice to either let this river go along like it's going or to create a watershed moment. And if you will cry out in the street, if you will do that, if you will stand, if you will mobilize, then you can get to justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. But you've got to have a watershed moment. So you've got two choices: to be at ease in Zion and let everything stay as it is, or you have the choice to become the watershed moment that is necessary for new currents of justice to flow. And I just stopped by Yale to say, I think I got a Holy Ghost suspicion. In the midst of all this craziness you've heard me talk about, and there's so much more, we must become the watershed moment in America. We must have a mass movement, a mass moral gathering of poor and low wealth people in Washington, but not a day, but a declaration. Not an event, but a sounding of the alarm. Not a one-time event, but a watershed that changes everything for years to come and says to America, we ain't gonna let you give up on what you promised. We're gonna fight until this is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And as long as we here, we're gonna fight for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And I give you back what Dr. King said before he died. Nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. God bless you.
Thank you, Reverend Barber. I feel like I should rename you Amos Barber. That was a very powerful presentation. We want to give you a few minutes to ask questions, and we have two ushers there. Here's one, and there's the other right there with microphones. So if you would raise your hand, and one of the ushers, either Samara or Ria, will bring a mic to you. I'd ask if you would identify yourself just briefly, and be sure that you disguise any comment you would like to make in the form of a question. And Reverend Barber will entertain your questions. So the floor is open.
June 20th, 2022. My question is, how many of you going to try to join us for that watershed moment and gather as many people as you can?
Hello.
Yes, sir.
My name is Noah Humphrey, MDiv second year. One thing that we see is that we preach this decisions. We preach a way to help and understand and grow, but recognizing the history is so important. And one of those is James Pennington. When will James Pennington get his degree? And I say this as a point of saying that the history that we make now, how do we as the younger generation start the watershed?
Well, first of all, I think part of what I was trying to say is that you discern watersheds don't happen all the time. I want to tell you the watershed has already started. The Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, been organizing for 3 years. We've got 47 coordinating committees, over 2,500 clergy, a whole contingency of young people like yourself. One of the grown graduates from this school is now leading the national religious arm, Casimir Brown. Right now, she's been coordinating and fighting for 3 years. So when you see what you get in it. And the other thing I would say is that we have learned, you know, when I started, I had people come to me and say, Remember, what we need is a black agenda. I said, no, we don't. They said, you don't need a black agenda? I said, no, not alone. You can't limit your morality to black. We don't just need a women's agenda. We don't just need we need a unified moral fusion agenda. And what I mean by moral fusion is where you come to understand that the same forces that suppress the vote, which is not in this moment about Jim Crow, because the suppression we see now is not just after black people. It can't be. If the same voter suppression bill that's happening in Texas is happening in Montana, it can't just be about black people. The same forces that try to take indigenous people's land, the same forces that block Latino people and Haitian people from just immigration, and the same forces that engage in mass incarceration are the same forces that block living wages, are the same forces that deny health care. Check the records. Are the same forces that that won't address the climate, the same forces that cut health education, the same forces that support the war economy, and the same forces that will allow religious nationalism to set a immoral and distorted framework for political engagement. So if, in fact, the same forces are doing the same thing, if they are cynical enough to be together, we ought to be wise enough, discerning enough, and smart enough to coming together. And if we do that in that process, we have an agenda that meets all people. Now, am I suggesting that we submerge race? Not at all. I'm suggesting that we understand the interlocking injustices of all of these things, as Dr. King talked about. And we recognize that in order to truly address them, you have to have a moral fusion, intersectional movement. So as a second year, how do you get involved in the watershed? I invite you to start organizing for June 18th, not as a day. We have no illusions that one day, but what we know is every moment in history needs a watershed. Montgomery opened up a lot of other things. Seneca Falls opened up a lot of other things. Frederick Douglass's speech in 1852, after the Dred Scott decision, when many people said the abolition movement was over, opened up a lot of things. There has to be these critical moments that are not about a day. And lastly, as you heard me, we must make sure, if we're going to follow the model of Amos, the kind of meeting we must have in the face of the nation is the meeting where the impacted people become the face and the voice of the meeting and not just people speaking on behalf of them. And I don't know what it fully means, Dean, when the text says, and God says, then I'll visit you. I just want to find out, because I got a suspicion when God visits something, injustice doesn't stay there. When God visits, when God's love and God's grace, mercy invades a situation, that too is a watershed moment. And so I'm willing to bet on the text and bet on God. But what I do know is we have not completed that watershed moment that Martin King and Rosa Parks. And how many of you know Amelia Boyington, that was beat on the Edmonds Pettus Bridge, was also a resident of Resurrection City? See, there's so much of this that we've not connected. And I know that we cannot leave the dream of the welfare rights workers and the dream of Dr. King and so many others assassinated on a balcony. if there's ever been a time to pick up the prophet's baton and carry it the next few miles down the road, it's right now. And so I would invite you to join in with those who are building this watershed moment.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes. We'll let this be, if somebody's got one more, we can take one more, and then we're past time. Okay, back over here. If you want to hand him the mic next, please.
Hi, my name is Edwin, first year MDiv student and local pastor here in Connecticut. Reverend Barber, you are a man that gets to travel. You see a lot of cities. We're seeing more and more gentrification.
Sure.
I'm wondering, how do you see gentrification being employed to disrupt collective communities that are that would rather come together to organize? How do you see that being employed in that manner?
It's a part of, again, the tricks and the trickery and the policy decisions that are made, which is, again, why we must come together. I would like for all of you to go Google the third Reconstruction agenda of the Poor People's Campaign. And in that, we have an entire piece on housing, guaranteed housing, and challenging these various forms of trying to separate communities legally and policy-wise, and thereby separating the possibility of people coming together. And yet we must overcome it, right? So in our movement, we have another kind of gentrification, if you will, and that is the political separation that people have tried to engage in separating the people from Appalachia from the people in Alabama, the white people in Appalachia. So what do? We bring them together in the movement. I mean, we know what the problems are, which is another reason we've got to have a generationally transformative mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington to the polls. And so on June 18th, what you're going to see is that white woman from Appalachia, a whole group of them standing together with black women from the Delta, saying that you're not going to divide us anymore, right? And that our pain, we're not only going to lift up our pain, but we're going to also put before the nation what it must do. Because in this moment, I'm not always sure the nation, see, here's the other thing. I'm not always sure, neither was Martin or any, that the nation will listen. But that has absolutely nothing to do with us speaking. It has absolutely nothing to do with us offering the way. Didn't the prophets do three things? They criticized the current reality. They announced the doom that would happen if the reality continued. And they offered hope. And one time, I think, Gene, over in Ezekiel was so clear, he said, God said to Ezekiel, look, I ain't sure they're going to listen because they're stiff-necked people. But at least make sure that they know a prophet has been among them. We must make sure that the nation has no excuse, that the world has no excuse for not addressing the sins. Y'all still use that word up here in the North, right? The sins of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. So Rosa Parks didn't know all that was going to happen if she sat down and spoke up, but she knew she had to. She discerned in that moment. Dr. King didn't know all that would happen if there was a poor people's campaign with Resurrection City. He knew we had that. And evidently, the society knew how powerful it was because they shot him. And so the work has not been finished. So we don't yet know in America what could happen and what would happen if poor, low-wealth people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality, along with religious leaders, along with activists, would truly do what God told Amos to do, go in the streets and cry loudly and lament and declare, not on our time, not on our watch. I'm suggesting, let's find out.
Reverend Barber, my name is Cameron. I'm a third-year student at the School of the Environment and also the Divinity School. We actually met at a Moral Mondays in Raleigh about 5 or 6 years ago. As you're talking, I can't help but think about the trajectory from the Southern strategy to Newt Gingrich and the Tea Party movement to the modern Republican Party and the white grievance politics that undermine the moral fusion movement that you're talking about. Could you talk a little bit about the manifestation of white grievance politics in America today and how that might be undermining the work that you're trying to do?
Well, I think it's inspiring the work we're doing. I tend to look at it a different way. See, I'm a Frederick Douglass believer. Frederick Douglass said when the Dred Scott decision came down, he said, as monstrous as this decision is, I receive it cheerfully. Not because I'm crazy or insane, but because I know that every attempt to ally and end the abolition movement has only served to intensify and embolden its agitation. So, and he said, and perhaps in this moment, the Dred Scott decision is actually a necessary link in the chain of events leading to the downfall of the whole system. Pride cometh before the fall. The pride, the arrogance of white supremacy and racism actually ends up producing its own overthrow. Always has. It is out of the despair that hope and prophetic hope. Now, am I naive to suggest it's not dead? No. But I would go a little further with the analysis. You see, that's why the Pope is right, and I mentioned that neoliberalism, for instance, and trickle-down economics have been the problem. Democrats tend to lean into neoliberalism. Republicans need to lean into trickle-down. Both of them are problematic. Yes, you've had white grievance, but you've had too much black silence. Yes, you've had white grievance, but you've also had too many black folk who will get all riled up about voting rights and won't say nothing about health care or living wages. When Manchin, for instance, blocked living wages in February and took it out of the Affordable American Rescue Plan, why didn't we call that racism? Why didn't we call it what it was, racism and classism? Because it blocked 41% of African Americans from coming up out of living wages, but it also blocked 31% of Americans. So what our movement says from a moral analysis standpoint is that our critique of what's going on is too shallow. And we've got to be careful that we don't just get locked in to these puny, weak, shallow arguments of left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, and even black versus white. There is a place we must go now that is in a deep morality, born out of Scripture, born of our deepest constitutional traditions, that says all of these issues are interlocking. And so, yes, I'm bothered by white grievance, but I also know that sometimes the media blames white folk for stuff white folk don't even do. If I was white, I'd get mad. Like in West Virginia. They say West Virginia is Trump country. No, it's not. They say Trump won by 40%. Well, he did. But the number of poor and low-wealth white people that just don't vote because they don't believe any of the parties is concerned about them. And when you go among them, they say, Reverend Barber, no president has even visited us since Lyndon Baines Johnson. That ain't Newt Gingrich's problem. That's not Trump's problem. That's a problem even of those. I'll give you an example. It's public now, so I'll tell you about it. For 8 months, poor and low-wealth people and moral religious leaders, religious, Jewish, and leading economists, we've asked the Biden administration to meet with poor and low-wealth people and religious leaders. And the handlers, not the president, have blocked it. They invited me to a meeting just with black folk. I said, I don't want to go in a meeting just with black folk. They said, why not? I said, first of all, that doesn't even look like the march from Selma to Montgomery. Have y'all ever seen the pictures of the march? I said, and why do I want to make voting rights like it's a special interest of black people. You know, well, we're going to talk about voting. I was told this by some Democrats. Would the Poor People's Campaign agree to talk about voting rights but not to talk about living wages in the same conversation? See, I'm a different kind of cat. I hope when y'all see me, y'all don't just see black either. Because I'm black, I'm Tuscarora Indian, I'm white, I'm all that mixed up, and I own all of it. And my point, just like when I walk in the room, I'm not no black preacher, I'm a preacher who happens to be black. You're not going to limit me. And I don't just deal with race issues, nor do I see race only in the prescribed areas. That's part of the problem. People that put up, we've had marches on Washington that were one issue. That is not the model of Dr. King. You don't have a march on Washington. Dr. King never talked about one issue. Even at the end of the March on Washington, the Selma to Montgomery March, Dr. King talked about how that segregation and voter suppression were stratagems to keep the masses of Negro and poor white people from coming together to form a political base that could transform the economic architecture of this country. He never talked about voting rights as just the issue of black people. He talked about it in terms of how it was the power to reshape the economic, where too many folk now have gone backwards from that argument rather than forward. So some of it's white grievance. Some of it is our analysis too shallow, too weak, too puny. And some of it is black side. It grieved me to my heart this morning when I had to say in the sermon that the Pew Research Center did an analysis of 50,000 sermons. And even in black congregations, the issues of poverty and justice did not register as 1% of the sermons for that year, or 0.5% of the sermon. So what I'm trying to say, what our movement is suggesting, is that there are a lot of different reasons. But whatever those reasons are, we need a watershed moment. And I'm more ready to focus more on rallying and organizing what Amos was told by God to organize. I'm more interested in the Pentecost right now than the trickery of Caesar. Because if we can organize that meeting and organize and that Pentecost, it will expose and everybody doesn't want to do this. Why in the Poor People's Campaign, I've had folks tell me, Reverend Barber, we would join, but you let gay people in. Well, then don't come. I'm looking for the remnant. We're looking for the remnant. The remnant that loves God's humanity. The remnant that will stand against voter suppression, but will also stand against ecological devastation. The remnant does not join with coalitions just because of your issue, and as soon as your issue is won, you run away from the rest of the folks. I'm looking for the kind of moral fusion movement where people say we're all together. And I know it's not going to be everybody, but God never said it had to be. He said, find that remnant. And I'm just asking y'all at Yale, do y'all want to be in the remnant? And then in that remnant, we can address the various ways. But if we're going to address the problems of the day, we're going to even have to have the courage of self-critique. Because ain't nobody's hands clean. See, don't ever forget, I'm sorry, Dean, I'll shut up here. Don't ever forget the great confession of Isaiah. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips. There is dirt. Did you hear me start today and say Dr. King was killed by his own denomination before he was shot by an assassin bullet? And you can't walk past that. Right? So if you're willing to do serious, in-depth moral analysis and recognize that there's been no progressive transformation in this country without a moral watershed moment, you can't find it in history. And so what we need in this moment, And I looked out at Niagara Falls. A watershed is raggedy. It's got some boulders that pop up in the middle of it, but it's powerful. It's uneven. It ain't perfect, but it's transformative. And that's what we've got to have. We believe in this moment.
We'll allow one more question. That's it. Then people will need to go.
Reverend Barber, thank you so much. Before returning to Christianity, I looked at a couple of other texts that talked about other ideologies on Christendom, not to take away from Jesus' death and resurrection. But Jesus said, "These things you shall do and greater." And so in the light of your talk on a mass movement, I sometimes wonder, and I want your thoughts on this, we're waiting for Jesus to come. We're waiting for things to happen, but I sometimes wonder if in our coming together is when the Spirit of Jesus comes. And possibly this is something I should probably talk with my professors about and not understanding how the Bible works. But I think about that, like movies like Avatar, I don't mean to be corny.
No.
When the blue people at the end were holding hands and coming together and raising up a spirit that actually changed their environment. So I welcome your thoughts on that.
I think if we're dealing with God, who always is, and as old preachers used to say, who's always coming from where he's been and going where God is always going where he's always seen. If that's the case, I don't know always if we can measure. What I do know is where God is located. As I said this morning, God said, I'm amongst the least of these. I'm in you. There's a realized eschatology and a yet to be. That whatever we do now has to some ways be hooked to what we believe is coming. And so in this moment, I think that everything is already here that necessitates us doing what we need to do, because we're here, our conscience is awakened, and the pain is here. And the presence of the pain necessitates a response. One of the greatest things that has shaped my life is when Dr. William Clare Turner, professor of pneumatology at Duke University, said this to me years ago, when I was in school. He said, true evangelicalism, however you want to shape it, he said, you can call your experience of faith a multitude of things. You can call it washed, born, slain in the Spirit, baptized, what's it called when you're sprinkled? You can call it catechized. You can call it, you went to the meeting and tarried all night. But at the end of the day, if whatever you call it doesn't produce a quarrel with the world's injustices, then your claim of it being spirit is terribly suspect. And that's all I'm suggesting. That God is already on the side of the poor. God is already where God is calling us to be. And that's what he said to Amos. I know all this stuff is going on. What I need to know is, do you know it? And if you know it, will you at least cry about it? Notice the text. He didn't say, will you pick up a gun about it? Will you beat somebody up about it? Will you at least publicly lament about it so that it cannot ever anymore be covered up? And he gives this answer. If you do that, I'll visit. And I wish there was more to that visit. But it's not. But it sure gives us a whole lot of curiosity. So what I'm saying is, let's get to crying. Let's build a watershed. Let's hook up with poor, lower people and everybody else. Let's lament. Let's take off the covers, y'all. Let's say to America, you can't anymore preach without a conscience. Let's expose. Let's say that the hope of the nation and the world is determined on how you treat the least of these. And let's give the least of these the biggest, boldest stage ever. And see what God does when God is both here and coming, both at the same time.